Over the past few weeks, we have considered the subject, our obligation to the next generation. Summarized in the title of that psalm, Teach Your Children Well. So far, we have considered the importance of teaching them about the Lord, teaching them about life, teaching them about love. This morning, we're going to conclude with teaching them about responsibility. Trust me, I tried all week to come up with an L word for responsibility, and I couldn't come up with it. I think if you polled members of my generation and asked them what bothered them about the next generation, the generations coming up, you'd probably hear things like a poor work ethic, a sense of entitlement. Now, maybe not everybody would agree with that, but those are things we commonly hear from the older generation about the younger generation. Others think this might be unwarranted. Well, according to Psychology Today, science supports the idea that millennials do have a lower work ethic. There is a nationally representative project called Monitoring the Future. They have been interviewing high school seniors since 1976, and they ask them the same questions. And one of those questions, they ask if you would describe yourself as not wanting to work hard. Baby boomers, 26% said yes, I really don't want to have to work hard. And that's grown 30% for Gen X, and 38% of millennials don't want to work hard. Then they asked them, would you be willing to work overtime? 59% of baby boomers said, sure, I'll work overtime. That went down to 56% for Gen X, and then 47% for the millennials. And then they asked, if you had enough money, would you not work at all? Now, honestly, I'm surprised this isn't 100%. 22% of baby boomers said, if I had enough money, I wouldn't work at all. 29% of millennials. Honestly, I think the rest are just lying. But you see the trends that are happening. But here's something to consider. While we might complain that these younger generations coming up don't value work as we do, they want more money, they want to buy expensive things, they have a sense of entitlement, that I deserve these things without necessarily having to work for them. We're not so quick to take responsibility for their lack of, responsibility. Bob Russell writes in his book, Find Us Faithful. If we are to pass our faith on to the next generation, parents and other Christian adults must train children how to handle responsibility. If we expect them to be successful adults carrying out life's important assignments, we must equip them while they're young. That is our obligation to the next generation because, folks, it doesn't come naturally. They're not going to learn about responsibility on their own, and they're not going to learn it from our culture. If we don't do it, who will? So we bear a lot of the responsibility for the lack of responsibility in our younger generations. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 1:8, "Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching." My question is this: are we teaching? Are we instructing our young people about anything? And if so, what are we instructing them? What are they learning from us? Or have we just kind of sent them out and said, you'll figure it out? Kind of the old sink or swim method of teaching somebody how to swim. Drop them in the deep end and you'll figure it out or you won't. That's not teaching. That's not helping them understand what responsibility is all about. So I would say our obligation to the next generation is to teach them about responsibility. How do we do that? I think the first way is to teach them to be responsible for their chores. An important part of rearing children is teaching them how to handle work responsibly. I mean, even in the Ten Commandments, it says 6 days you shall do your work. Now, the emphasis there was on the 1 day of rest. It's taken for granted that you work 6 days. We've whittled that down to 5. Some even have a 4-day work week. Good for you. But the idea is you work, and that's the norm. That's not the exception. We were created as human beings to be workers. Work is not part of the curse on sin. Some people have that mistaken idea. Because Adam and Eve said, no, I got to work. No, work was introduced before sin. In Genesis 2, it says God put Adam and Eve in the garden to work it. They didn't sin until the next chapter. Now, it's true, work got harder because of sin. But the principle of work is something that was created into us. We are made to work. John Rosemond is a popular family counselor and author. For years, he had a column in the paper and talked a lot about parenting, raising children. Said he often asks parents whether they regularly expect their children to perform chores around the house for which they are not paid. He said about 1 in 10 say yes. 10% of parents have their children doing chores around the house and don't pay them for it. Even though most of those parents had to do chores when they were growing up. Maybe that's why they don't make their kids, I don't know. I know some parents take it to the extreme. That's why we have kids, so we don't have to work. I am not advocating child slave labor, okay? Let's make that very clear. That's not what we're talking about. Rosemond goes on to write, in too many of today's families, children are consuming goods and resources, but they're not making a contribution that even begins to balance their consumption. That will eventually handicap their ability to be good citizens and good neighbors. A viable culture depends more on contribution than on consumption. Give each of your kids a clearly defined role in your family. Start assigning chores when a child reaches age 3 and gradually expand the role and responsibilities from there. It will do us all a world of good if you do. Not only does that benefit the child, it benefits everybody else when they grow up. You see, believe it or not, chores actually give a child a sense of security. It builds their self-esteem. It gives them a sense of belonging in the family. They're contributing. They're having a part. And trust me, if you get them at 3, 4, and 5, they want to help. You ever notice that? Young kids, they want to help. They want to do what mommy and daddy's doing. And it makes them feel good. If you start at 13, forget it. It's too late by then. It's a good thing. I mentioned Bob Russell earlier. He said that giving chores to a child gives them a sense of belonging since they're contributing members of the family rather than parasites living off the family. I read that and I thought, ooh, that's kind of harsh. Parasites? But then I got into the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs doesn't use parasites. It uses a couple other words we don't use very much anymore. One of them is sluggard, and the other is slothful. And, that's maybe that's a little harsh too. Warren Wiersbe has other words for such people. He writes, the biggest thieves of all are the lazy people who could work but won't. Amen. The people who consume what others produce but produce nothing for others to use. Yeah. Another resource describes the sluggard in Proverbs as the lazy person who is making no contribution to the economy but is apparently subsisting in some manner on the efforts of other people. In every society, there are people who, although able-bodied, make sure you catch that phrase, are unwilling to expend energy in working for a living. Such habitually indolent people are parasites on the society, there's that word again, having no intention of doing anything other than the most minimal of duties, and only that under extreme pressure. It's like the fellow I've mentioned before. Politician goes to a workplace, a factory, and he's going around shaking hands. He says, hey, well, how long have you been working here? He said, ever since the boss threatened to fire me. Some people, that's the only way they're going to work. You got to threaten them. Now, please understand, I'm not saying that anybody who is poor is automatically lazy. That's not what the Bible's talking about here. These are people who can work but won't. I understand there are people who can't. And God makes provision for them. And I do believe we should extend grace and mercy to them. I'm talking about people who are able-bodied, those who have the ability to do so, they choose not to. That's what Proverbs is describing. Consider Proverbs 6, verses 6 through 11. Proverbs chapter 6. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler. May I add there, no boss or foreman. Yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will overtake you like a bandit, scarcity like an armed man. Doesn't pull any punches here, does it? The importance of working, being responsible for yourself. Elsewhere in Proverbs, we read in chapter 10, verse 4, lazy hands make a man poor, but diligent hands bring wealth. He who gathers crops in the summer is a wise son, but he who sleeps during harvest is a disgraceful son. Proverbs 18, verse 9 says, one who is slack in his work is brother to one who destroys. Chapter 21, the sluggard's craving will be the death of him because his hands refuse to work. And again, notice that, refuse to work. Not unable, but refuse to work. All day long he craves for more. Here's that sense of entitlement. I want more. I want more. I deserve more. Bigger, better, newer. I deserve that. Why should I have to work for it? See, that's human nature. That's what we're all born with. We have to be taught differently. Then finally in Proverbs 26, the sluggard says, there's a lion in the road, a fierce lion roaming the streets. As a door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. He's too lazy to bring it back to his mouth. Isn't that a powerful word picture? The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who answer discreetly. I think that last passage is really pointed. Notice at the beginning, there's a lion outside. I can't go to work today because we've got excuses. You ever known somebody that's got an excuse for everything? I think there are people that have college degrees in making excuses. They're really good at it. Problem is, if you're good at making excuses, you're probably good at nothing else. And this is all part of our human nature. This is the folly that is born into a child, and it's up to the parents to correct that. We must teach them about responsibility. We need to teach them that work is a virtue. And since all valuable lessons are first taught at home, that's where it begins. It doesn't start when they go to school. It doesn't start when they get their first job. It doesn't start with high school graduation or when they go off on their own. It begins in the home. And it needs to begin early. And I don't think there's anything wrong. In fact, there's a whole lot to be said for teaching our children to be responsible for some chores at home. Let them learn what it means to work. I've often said if I had about a 3 or 4 year old right now, every day we would do something they don't want to do. Why? Because that's life, folks. Life's full of doing things you don't want to do, but you got to do them anyway. So you might as well learn that when you're young. It does remind me, though, there was a Calvin and Hobbes. Remember Calvin and Hobbes, the cartoon? There was one where the dad says, "Where are my glasses? Have you seen my glasses?" And then you see Calvin walking out with his hair actually combed, which normally it's not. He's wearing his dad's glasses, and he says, "Come on, Calvin, do something to make him miserable. It'll build character." And then in the next scene, the mom is just rolling on the floor laughing. I'm not saying make kids miserable, all right? I'm not saying be a slave driver. I'm not saying work them from sun up till sundown. I'm just saying teach them responsibility. And a great way to do that is give them something to do at home. I know my mom did that. That's how she kept us kids in line when she was working. You know, she had to work until this time, and we came home a little earlier than that, so we had chores to do when we got off school until we made, that was wise. And I know my brother and I, when we got to the age where we could work outside the home, those bosses were impressed. Hey, you actually know how to work. You actually do what you're told. Yeah, that's the way we were raised. That's not automatic. We've got to teach our children about responsibility. You remember Dear Abby, the column in the newspaper back in the day? She once wrote, "If you want your children's feet on the ground, put some responsibility on their shoulders." I like that. I think that's good. The next way to teach them to be responsible is to be responsible for their choices. Oh, wow, we need this today. I think that great philosopher Don Henley of the Eagles got it right. In one of their songs, it says, "Turn on the tube, what do I see? A whole lot of people crying, 'Don't blame me.' They point their crooked little finger at everybody else, spend all their time feeling sorry for themselves. A victim of this, a victim of that, your mama's too thin, your daddy's too fat. Get over it." Amen to that.
Amen.
We have raised a generation of victims that want to blame everybody else for everything, but nothing's my fault. Don't hold me accountable. Don't hold me responsible. I can't help it. That's another great cry that we hear. We need to teach our young generations. They have the power to choose. And you alone are responsible for the choices you make. One day when you stand before God, there isn't going to be anybody around for you to blame.
Amen.
There's going to be anybody else you can point to and say, "Oh, but it's their fault. Oh, but they..." God said, "I don't hear it."
Amen.
God isn't the only one who's tired of hearing about the excuses and the blaming. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 18. Ezekiel chapter 18. Beginning in verse 1, "The word of the Lord came to me. What do you people mean by quoting this proverb about the land of Israel? The fathers eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge." See, what does that mean? You ever bit into something sour and you just grind your teeth and you know that feeling in your mouth? You get it? Okay? That's what he's talking about. But what they're saying is our fathers ate the sour grapes and now we have the gods of granddaddy. Wham. What does God say about that? As surely as I live, declares the Lord, you will no longer quote this proverb in Israel. In other words, I don't want to hear it.
Amen. Yeah.
For every living soul belongs to me, the Father as well as the Son, both alike belong to me. The soul who sins is the one who will die. And if you go into that chapter, he goes on about, I'm not going to hold the Father accountable for what the Son does. I'm not going to hold the Son accountable for what the Father does. You each bear responsibility for yourself. You make choices, you bear responsibility for it. That's God saying. And we need to teach our children enough of the excuses, enough of the blame. Because when we blame somebody else, then I don't have to fix it. If I can blame somebody else, it's not my fault, it's not my problem. I'm just a victim. Somebody help me. Somebody save me. Your choice, your responsibility. Now, does that mean we all have to do it on our own? No. There's plenty of resources, there's plenty of help out there. I believe it's not good that we live life alone. We need each other. We need families. We need church families. We need help along the way. But what we don't need is somebody else carrying us. What we don't need is somebody else taking the responsibility for us. Because that doesn't work. Again, one day you're going to stand before God, and you're going to stand before Him on your own. And this has to be taught to the next generation. You know, the blame game goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Right? Adam and Eve sinned. God comes along and says to Adam, what'd you do? Adam said, the woman that you gave me. I mean, he's blaming two directions. So God says to the woman, what happened? The snake. I saw a cartoon this last week about that little conversation, and the snake is thinking, oh, sure, point to the guy that has no arms. You'll notice the serpent doesn't blame anybody. See, that's ingrained into our sin nature. We don't want to accept responsibility. We want to take responsibility. It's always somebody else's fault. It's always blaming somebody else. God says, I don't want to hear it anymore. You are responsible for the choices you make. And this is so true in our day and age of addiction. And the very popular concept these days is that addiction is a disease. I got a real problem with that. Because if it's a disease, then somebody else has to fix me. I'm not saying addiction is a sin. I believe addiction is a consequence of sin, and we're going to talk about consequences in a minute. Well, you remember before we started using the word addiction all the time, we used to call it a habit. How are habits made? Choices. How are habits broken? Choices. And it's the only way. They want to call it something else. It's no longer drug addiction, it's substance abuse. Nope, that's too offensive. It's substance use disorder. Okay. You want to call it substance use disorder? Fine. Who chooses when to use? The person. It's their choice. And until they choose not to use, they're going to continue to use. If you want to break free, if you want to be a victor instead of a victim, make the choices, because you're the only one that can do it. We are disempowering our young people by telling them they're victims, by telling them, oh, it's a disease. You were born that way. You can't help it. Oh, yes, you can. Now, do you need help along the way? Absolutely. You need somebody you can turn to when the times are tough? Yes, And that's where we step in and we're there for you. But we can't make that choice for you. You have to make it. And until you make that choice, you're not going to get anywhere. Be responsible for your choices. And then finally, and related to that, we need to teach them to be responsible for the consequences of their choice. God has created this universe with certain laws. In the physical realm, there's the law of gravity. We all know about it. Toss something up in the air, it's going to come down. That's gravity. There's also laws in the spirit realm. And one of them is described in the New Testament in Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7. Very, very simple concept. Paul writes, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." It's all about consequences. I like something that Charles Stanley wrote some time ago. Today is the father of tomorrow. Just think about that. The choices you make today are going to shape tomorrow, because those are the consequences. Everything we do produces consequences. Every choice we make, and even if that choice is to do nothing, it still has consequences. He went on to characterize the law of the harvest this way: we reap like we sow, we reap larger than we sow, and we reap later than we sow. Think about that. If you take a few seeds of corn and plant it in the ground, what's going to come up? Soybeans. Right? No. You get corn. What you plant is what you get. You reap like you sow. But do you get a few kernels? No. You get this big stalk with multiple heads that have lots of kernels. You reap larger than you sow. And when you put those seeds in the ground, does it come up the next day? No. You reap later than you sow. But here's the thing. You choose what you plant. You choose what you sow. The results are out of your hands. You make choices, and those choices have consequences, but you don't control the consequences. Once you've spoken a word, once you've performed an act, it's out there, and what happens is out of your hands. Now, I'm not saying you're not responsible for the consequences. I'm saying you can't control them. And again, young people need to learn what you choose creates consequences, and once those consequences go out, they're out of your hands. And it's not only on you. If you take a rock and drop it in the pond, what happens? Well, there's a splash right where the rock goes in, but then there's this ripple effect, right? And it just keeps going out. Much larger than the place where the rock went in. That's what consequences are like. It's like that ripple effect. And first it affects those closest to you, and then it just keeps going, and it affects all kinds of people. These are lessons we need to teach the younger generations. What you do matters, and not just to you. What you do has consequences for those around you. Sometimes unintended consequences, and yet you're still responsible for the choices you make and the consequences that follow. How do we teach this to the next generation? Well, we need to let them suffer the consequences of their choices. Sometimes we have to be the ones to enforce the consequences of those choices. And I know there are many well-intentioned parents who love their children so much they never want to see them experience pain, and so they shield them from any pain. Oh, I don't ever want to see my kid cry. I don't ever want my child to feel bad. Well, you know what? If you have an adult that never feels guilt about something they've done, they're called a psychopath. Guilt is a good thing. When you do something wrong, you should feel bad about it, and you should understand that there's consequences. Teach them when they're young, because the consequences they face from mom and dad are going to be a whole lot less than the ones they get at school. Well, it used to be. What happens at work, by the police, later on in life. They need to be taught. They need to learn. And it's not going to come automatically. And it's certainly not going to be taught in school, and it's not going to be taught by the government. It's not going to be taught on social media. It's up to us, parents, grandparents, members of the church. We are the ones that must teach our children well. If our church, if our community, if our culture is going to survive, we must begin emphasizing the importance of responsibility. We need the next generation to become responsible adults. And we do that by teaching them to be responsible in their chores, responsible in their choices, responsible for their consequences. Former First Lady Barbara Bush spoke at a commencement a number of years ago, and she said this: "Our success as a society depends not on what happens at the White House, but what happens in your house." That's true. All the attention goes to what's happening in the White House, but what really matters is what happens in your house. What are we doing to teach our children well? Our obligation to the next generation is to teach them the truth. Teach them about the Lord. Teach them about life. Teach them about love. Teach them about responsibility. Because if we don't, who will?